So this quarter, we have heard from experts across a variety of fields discuss racism in design and equity-centered approaches. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Shanyce Campbell, who is going to share her expertise in the field of education. Dr. Campbell is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education. She's also a research faculty at Pitt Center for Urban Education. Dr. Campbell's research focuses on understanding how policies and practices influence access to quality learning opportunities for students of color. Employing quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods, she explores various institutional factors associated with advancing students of color's opportunities to learn, including educator quality, school community partnerships, and curricular access. Dr. Campbell's work has appeared in American Educational Research Journal, Educational Researcher, and Race, Ethnicity, and Education. And in 2019, she received the Palmer O. Johnson Memorial Award for the most outstanding article appearing in an American Educational Research Association sponsored journal. Dr. Campbell earned her Bachelor of Science, summa cum laude, in accounting with a minor in economics from North Carolina A&T State University, a historically Black college and university. And she earned her PhD in public policy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as the first Black person and woman program graduate. She was also a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Education at the University of Michigan. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Campbell.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those of us who are on the East Coast. So yes, I am excited to share some of the work that I have been doing. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Let me move you all up a little bit. Okay. So today I'm going to spend a little time just talking about what does just design or just policies look like, and I'm going to use the example of teacher evaluation systems to explore what do we mean, or how do we understand just policies or just designs. And so before I go into the talk, I just want to quickly mention how important it is to think about, why do we examine policies or education policies from a critical lens? And it helps us to challenge and disrupt assumptions that shape the education policy landscape. And in challenging and disrupting these landscapes or these assumptions, we're able to point towards some kind of educational justice in hopes to transform schools. So that's like why I come to the work from a critical perspective. All right. So we know that students of color are often schooled in dehumanizing environments, right? And so this is evidenced by unjust discipline referrals, students of color being placed in less rigorous courses, teachers having lower expectations of students of color, and ultimately students of color being pushed out of schools in general. And central to these traumatic experiences that students of color experience are teachers, right? And so we know from the policymakers and scholars both have agreed that teachers are the most influential school level factor in terms of student success. What we don't know, however, is, what we also know is that there's so much variation in terms of teacher quality. And what that led to was the creation of teacher evaluation systems, which were introduced at a large scale in 2009 as a result of Race to the Top, which is a competitive grant. So I'm going to talk you through like the historical nature of how did we get to the current teacher evaluation systems that we have now, and then kind of talk about the evaluation systems, and then move into how do we think about them as just education policies. So teacher evaluation systems came out of the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So this is an act which we call the Recovery Act that President Obama signed in February of 2009. And this was a result of the fact that we were in a Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. And so as a result of the recession, the Recovery Act was passed. And what it did was provided $800 billion to stimulate the economy, right? And so the goal was that we're supposed to either create or save about 3.5 million jobs. And so of that $800 billion, 93 billion went to the US Department of Education. And so the Department of Education decided to encourage or incentivize states to innovate, or at least create some kind of conditions to innovate and reform. And one of the ways that they did this was by allocating about $5 billion to states, right? And so states had the option of applying for this competitive grant called the Race to the Top, right? This is where Race to the Top comes from. And so the task for the states was that they were tasked with improving student outcomes. And so outcomes meaning test score performance, closing racialized test score gaps, improving graduation rates, as well as making sure that students were prepared to either go to college or to enter the workforce. And one of the key features of Race to the Top, so there were several aspects of the application, right? So one aspect was around turning around the lowest achieving schools. Another aspect was great teachers and great leaders. And so that was the name of one of the categories. And so the great teachers, great leaders actually had majority of the points were assigned to this great teachers, great leaders. So states were evaluated on these different aspects and were given points. And so the most of the points were given if you were doing something in terms of promoting or creating great teachers or great leaders. And so that's what we had, that's where the teacher evaluation system came from. So there are 4 major goals of this evaluation system. So the first was to measure student growth, and to measure it not only at the school level, but the individual level. So they wanted to see how students were growing within an academic year. And so that was one of the big things, was how do we measure student growth? Another goal of the teacher evaluation system was to provide timely and constructive feedback. And part of that feedback was to incorporate the student growth. The third goal, and these are in no order, but the third goal was to differentiate teacher effectiveness, right? So how do we determine what teachers are effective and what teachers are ineffective? And this was supposed to be done in a quote unquote rigorous, transparent, and fair way. So that's the language of Race to the Top, the rigorous, transparent, and fair. And so in differentiating teacher effectiveness, so who's effective and who's not, the evaluation system was also supposed to inform personnel decisions. And these decisions included whether or not teachers needed to receive professional development or coaching. If you, for example, if you received high evaluation scores, then you were more likely to get a bonus. So there, your compensation was tied to these evaluation systems. Also, promotion was tied. So you were either able to be granted tenure or full certification as a result of your evaluation score, or you were fired as a result of your score. And the idea around promotion and firing, they also use this is the 2 areas where they also use that language around rigorous, transparent, and fair. So this chart here shows how the teacher evaluation system was scaled up. And so as a result of the Race to the Top grant, even those states that did not even apply for the grant monies, they still use or created a teacher evaluation system. And so what you see here is that in 2009, so this is before Race to the Top, before the grants. So in 2009, 15 states required annual evaluations of all teachers. Whereas in 2013, you had it about doubled, right? So you had 28 states that required annual evaluations of all teachers. And this is not these are not the number of states that actually use evaluations. these were the numbers that required annual evaluations for all teachers. So if you were an experienced teacher, you tend to not have to be evaluated every year. One of the other things that I want to point out on this chart is that you see on the bottom, you see that in terms of using the evaluation systems as a basis for tenure decisions, so whether or not you get tenured or not. In 2009, there were no states that used evaluations for tenure decisions, whereas in 2013, you see that there are about 19 states. So as a part of the evaluation system, there are two major components. And so some states differ, but for the most part, you either had, you had classroom observations and you had the use of student test scores. There were other things that could be included, if, like, for example, teachers who don't teach tested subjects. There were other measures that they would use. And in some states actually use student surveys. And so what you see here is that 45 of the states required the classroom observation. So required that the school administrators, whether that's the principal or the AP, the assistant principal, were required to come into your class and conduct evaluation. So that is just an overview. I just wanted to give you kind of like a brief overview of what is this teacher evaluation system, how did it come to be, so you can kind of think about how do we design for a just evaluation system. So now I want to turn our attention to thinking about that, right? So how do we design for just education policies? And we're going to use the teacher evaluation system as our example, as our guide. And so before we get into thinking about, or as I think about like, what is a just education policy, I think about the role that racism plays, right? And so I know a theme for the design lab for this quarter is around anti-racism. So I'm looking forward to discussions about like, how can we reimagine and redesign for just education policies. So if we think about the role of racism, the role that racism plays in policy design, the theoretical lens that I use is critical race theory. And central to critical race theory is the notion that racism is woven into the fabric of our society, right? Racism is just a part of our everyday lives. And as a result of it being a part of our everyday lives, which that means it's also a part of our everyday political systems, as we've seen recently. And so education policy is not, like, education policy is also affected by racism, right? And in that it can discriminate in its intent, in its practice, and consequence, right? So some may suggest that, okay, ed policy may not be, for example, racist in its intent, which we could argue. But even though it may not be racist in its intent, the way it's carried out, the way it's implemented, the way it's practiced could be racist, right? And it could result in actual racist consequences. And so if we think about education policy being able to discriminate, right, in its intent, practice, or consequence, this trickles down into schools, right? So schools are carrying out these policies that have been created. And so they're able to maintain institutional racism, which then impacts teachers, right? And so it impacts teachers differentially based on the teacher's racial identities, where in our US context, white teachers tend to be privileged or tend to benefit from the education policies that are created and that are actually practiced. So David Gilbourne, who is a critical race scholar out of the UK, talks about 3 different questions that we should be thinking about or asking when we're trying to evaluate education policies. And so I'll go through these 3 and then we'll look at them in the context of the teacher evaluation system. So the first one is around priorities, right? So who or what is driving education policy? The second is beneficiaries. So who wins and who loses as a result of these education policy priorities? And then finally, the effects or the outcomes. So what are the effects of the policy? So if we start by looking at the priorities, so who or what is driving education policy? I talked about earlier when we talked about like the history of how did these education evaluation systems come to be. We know that it was driven by the economy, right? Or some can say, oh, it was driven by capitalism. And so that was what was driving the creation. We also know that the US Department of Education was also driving the evaluation, as well as the State Department of Ed, who applied for the Race to the Top grant. And then finally, researchers, right? And so I say researchers were part of driving evaluation systems because a lot of the research that the states use around the fact that the teachers are the most important indicator in the class, in the school, and the fact that that beginning teachers are often placed in classrooms that have a high proportion of students of color. These were things that were actually mentioned in the Race to the Top application as to why the evaluation system was necessary. So research scholars played a role in driving the evaluation system, the creation of the evaluation system. So if we think about the beneficiaries, so who wins and who loses as a result of the teacher evaluation system priorities, I'm going to focus on research here to kind of show us who wins and who loses. So there's been research, there's been a lot of research that has been done as a result of the teacher evaluation systems, which started around 2010. I actually wrote my dissertation on the teacher evaluation systems. And there are like 4 major findings around that relate to race that we know from the literature. One, that teachers of color receive lower ratings than white teachers. In particular, Black women receive lower ratings than white women. Also, Black women are about 2 times more likely to be required to develop a punitive type of professional development plan. And then teachers who are assigned to classrooms that have a higher proportion of marginalized students, so who have a higher proportion of, for example, Black and brown students and or low income students, they tend to receive lower ratings. And we know that teachers of color are often more likely to be placed in classrooms with more students of color. And so if we think about who wins and who loses, based on the research, it would suggest that white teachers, for the most part, are winning in this teacher evaluation system priority, whereas teachers of color are quote unquote losing. And the sad thing about these findings is that out of all the work that has been done, the findings are consistent, like across geography. So whether or not you're studying North Carolina or California, like you're finding the same results. It also doesn't matter about the type of rater. So whether or not the rater is a principal or the rater is an outside person, an outside rater, the results still hold. Whether or not the evaluation system is a high stakes or low stakes. And we've looked at this using different types of rubrics, using different statistical techniques. And there's an article that just came out that looked at in-service versus pre-service teachers and showing the exact same thing. So I think we've made a clear case now about who's winning and who's losing as a result of teacher evaluation systems. So the last thing to think about is the outcomes, right? So what are the effects of the policy? And so I'm gonna talk through this through some potential outcomes, right? So say, for example, well, not for example, we know that teachers of color receive lower ratings than white teachers. So you have these 2 teachers in the school. Some potential outcomes of receiving low ratings for teachers of color are, one, that they're fired, right? So they have to go home. And so they leave the teacher workforce altogether. Another outcome is that they be transferred out of the school into another school. And so that increases your teacher turnover. Another outcome is that they stay in the school. So they're not fired, and they're not asked to switch schools, but they stay in the school, but then they're required to do this additional professional development. So in the results that I just talked about, they may have to do more punitive professional development. And then another outcome would be around workplace satisfaction. So if I'm in a school and I know that the white teachers are receiving better ratings than I am, that's going to affect my workplace satisfaction. And so we know based on the literature that teachers of color leaving the profession altogether when we already have a shortage of teachers of color. So teachers leaving altogether, teachers increasing teacher turnover, additional PD, and workplace satisfaction. We know from the literature that all of these things affect students of color and their academic success, right? And there's also a lot of literature that talks about the benefits of having a teacher of color if you're a student of color. So, right, it affects your learning, it affects your disciplinary referrals, it impacts the expectations that teachers have of you, that your teachers have of you. So we know that there are real benefits to having teachers of color in classrooms. So now let's turn into thinking about how do we redesign this quote, like, for lack of better words, this mess. So how do we redesign this mess? And so I have a couple recommendations that I'll go through, and then I would like to hear more from you as we kind of rethink and redesign and reimagine what a just evaluation system could look like. So I've organized my redesign recommendations around 3 different things. 1, professional development, 2, the technicality of the evaluation systems, and 3, accountability and transparency. So in terms of professional development, one of the recommendations would be to provide intense training for administrators. And so we know that across states, a lot of the administrators just have to do like a one-time, a couple of hours, it may even be online type of training. And so providing an ongoing training will help to ensure that administrators have some kind of deep knowledge and deep understanding about what the rubric is and how to use it. We should also be having conversations around centering anti-racism into the trainings, right? I think now a lot of people are doing a lot of trainings around implicit bias, anti-racism, and so that needs to be factored into teacher evaluation trainings. Also requiring that, administrators do an annual evaluation certification. So you have to be a certified trainer, you have to be a certified rater in order to evaluate your teachers. And if you're not certified, then the district, an idea would be that the district will come in and do your classroom observations. So the technical aspects would be, one technical aspect could be like requiring video recordings of the observations, right? And so as a part of the observation system or the process, principals come in, evaluate teachers, and then there's this post-observation conference that is between the teacher and the principal. And so they give you, your feedback and how you did. And so requiring that these observations be video recorded gives more evidence. So if I received, for example, on a scale of 1 to 5, if I received a 2, like the principal would have to show me where in the observation they saw this 2, whatever the 2 was a measure of. Also thinking about revising the evaluation rubric to be more culturally relevant. right. So I think like in terms of professional development, I made the comment around making sure that there's ongoing training so that there's this in-depth knowledge about how to use the evaluation. And so that assumes that the evaluation rubric by itself is a fair, non-racist type of rubric, which may not be the case, right? So we may need to consider revising the evaluation rubric so that it is more culturally relevant for teachers of color. And then the last is around accountability and transparency. So here I'm thinking about holding districts and schools accountable, right? And so this could look like having mandatory annual reports where every year the school has to report to the district around the scores that they gave to every teacher, and you know, kind of detailing that out by race and gender. And then holding principals responsible. So principals also are evaluated in this in this evaluation system reform. And so holding them accountable in some way for these inequities in teacher ratings is another way to improve or redesign the teacher evaluation systems. And so one of my good sisters, Bettina Love, has a book called We Want to Do More Than Survive. And so one of the things that she says is that, you know, reform ain't justice, right? And so reform does not lead us on the path to justice. And so she would argue that, like, and I would as well, that the work of the abolitionist work, right, to eradicate educational injustices have to draw on these things. So, right, it has to draw on anti-racism. It has to draw on being visionary thinking and creativity and healing. And so, in thinking about how should we think about redesigning or dismembering or abolishing the current evaluation system for something that allows for justice, I wanted to pose the question of what are some other design elements that we might consider in creating an anti-racist teacher evaluation system? And so now I'm going to actually open this up for discussion. Let me move this, and I'm going to stop share so I can see people. So any thoughts, any questions, but also thinking about what are other design elements that we might consider in creating an anti-racist teacher evaluation system?
So Dr. Campbell, would you like me to monitor the chat for you as questions come in too? Would that be helpful?
Yes, please. Yes.
So there is a question from the talk. Could you share some examples of how a rubric might be racist?
Yes. Okay. So let me think about one aspect. So I'm trying to think. So my work sits in North Carolina. So I'm trying to think about the 26 elements of their rubric. So leadership. Oh, so okay. So there is a dimension in North Carolina's rubric that looks at how students engage in the classroom, right? And so, and I'm not gonna be as precise and get it right, but in essence, it's like, you know, are your students behaving in the classroom? Are they, you know, sitting in their seats? Are they, you know, doing, like, raising their hands? All of these things, right? And so we know in terms of, from a cultural perspective, that that Black folks, like, I'm just going to use Black folks because this is what I know. The Black folks engage with each other in a very communal way, right? So the idea of call and response, for example, like we'll jump out, we'll throw something out, and then have the students throw something back out. And so if a principal is coming to that classroom and they may see it as chaotic, and they may see it as you don't have control of your classroom because students are not raising their hands, and you allow them to get up and move, because you know the whole idea of valuing movement. So that's one of the examples that I can think of right off top. And there may be even subtle ways, right? So like it may not be as concrete as that, right? It may be things in just the essence of why, like why was this evaluation, why was the rubric who was the rubric created by, right? Who created it? Who was at the table? Whose voices were able to take part in creating the rubric, right? Whose voices were left out of creating the rubric? So it doesn't have to be as tangible or straightforward as the example I provided. It could be whose voices are not heard, right?
As we're waiting for more questions, Dr. Campbell, I actually have a question kind of related to, because I was thinking who does design the rubrics? Like, is there a standard for like how these things are done? Like who is supposed to be at the table and who ends up being at the table, or who is at the table but voices aren't heard anyway? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I know that most of the rubrics, a lot of states use Danielson's framework for teaching as their rubric. And so this is a academic scholar who created a classroom observation rubric. I know that in North Carolina, they did not take up Danielson. And so who created it was members of the State Department of Education. And so we know that in terms of educational leadership, there are not a lot of folks of color who are at that table. But yeah, so that's what we know.
Do others have thoughts, returning to Dr. Campbell's question about sort of redesigning a teacher evaluation system?
Looks like Kristen threw another piece in there. Actually, Kristen, you want to say it?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to like dominate it all. So something that I think comes up a lot when you're kind of thinking about teaching students is whether you can have peer evaluations be part of how students are learning in the classroom. I wonder if that might be a useful part of, having, peer teachers evaluating, how the classroom is working.
So yeah, so in most states and in my work in North Carolina, yes, so peers, there is a peer evaluation. The problem though is that yes, there is a peer evaluation using the same rubric. The problem is that that evaluation and those ratings are not a part of the summative evaluation. So at the end of the year, this is where the principal goes in and gives the teacher a summative score, and that score is a score that that they use for personnel decision making. So yes, there is a peer element, but it's not being used for those more concrete, summative, punitive reasons or ways. But Kristen, let me jump back and ask you this question. So how might the use of peer evaluations, how could that mitigate racism?
Well, I mean, what I kind of had in mind was that, other teachers in a given school would know the students, they would know kind of cultural norms of a given, school. They would have more boots on the ground experience of how things work. And I think they might just have a better basis for evaluating how things are going. And I think it could also potentially be more constructive. If you're offering suggestions, like I know we were having a conversation recently about sort of like things that you learn that may or may not be formalized. And so if someone has prior experience, they can help you absorb and learn those things maybe more constructively.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. One of the pushbacks against principals evaluating teachers is, one, they don't have the content knowledge. So we hear that a lot, right? The principals don't have content knowledge in every area. And so how are they evaluating math if they don't have a math certification, right? And so you know, the peers are that's a valid, you know, part, right, of having more like content knowledge, more experience working with the students, etc. Yeah, I think I'm still like I think I'm still in this whole idea of like, yeah, but if the teacher is racist, then I don't know how beneficial that still is. But that's just a thought, you know, that may not be the case.
We have another question in the chat. In thinking about student test scores and how they are used to evaluate teachers, could you talk more about what test scores are used? Are they the statewide tests, like for example, MCAS in Massachusetts? I'm thinking back to a previous talk we heard in which English language learners typically face disparities in terms of these tests, especially math. Addressing the tests as well seems like a good way to help the redesign process.
Yes. So yes, it is the statewide standardized exam like the MCAS. And hold on. Yeah, so that is the exam. So addressing the test. So in what ways, Michaela, like in what ways will we address the test that will help us redesign the process?
I'll just unmute so I don't have to type out again.
Yes.
I don't have like a ton of experience with education. I'm just thinking maybe
you do. You've been in education for how long?
I only know from taking the MCAS myself. But, I'm just thinking about back to kind of who's at the table creating these things, like maybe going back to the tests themselves and trying to make the information more representative, what most students are learning, and kind of just trying to address it more. I don't know. I'm just thinking back to my own school.
Yeah.
Of how it was like everything was trying to get you to go to like a top 4-year college. Everything was kind of on that path. So maybe just making these tests more representative, you know, all sorts of learning styles, not just trying to look perfect to like go to Harvard or something. I'm just thinking of my own experience.
Yes, and as it relates to teacher evaluations, like a large part of the evaluation was based on what we call value-added models. So right, so it's based on teachers' ability to quote unquote grow the students. So the student came in with this test score, and so by the time they leave that teacher's classroom, their test score is supposed to grow. And so that was a big part of the evaluation system was whether or not teachers were growing students in terms of test scores. Yeah, so no, I think you're right. I think that we need to look at test scores more critically, and I think we have begun to like look at test scores more critically, in that like states or in some districts are opting out, like especially now some districts are opting out, and it's like, no, this has never been a good measure of learning, and so let's not do this now. And so I will say the interesting thing in terms of thinking about like injustices is the fact that teacher evaluations are still going on. now during COVID, during online learning. And so it's really interesting. And I'm trying to do pulling data off of Twitter now to look at a separate study that looks at like teachers' responses to, you know, COVID and doing teacher evaluation. So yeah. Gail, you had a question.
Yeah, hi. So I've been involved in doing teaching evaluations at UCSD and sort of thinking about the parallels to evaluating college teaching and how it's similar and different, but definitely lots of discussion about how, you know, in that case, it was primarily student evaluations and how those may be biased for different reasons, and sort of thinking about what are alternatives to that. And I just wanted to just mention some thoughts that we had as a committee sort of working through those things. And I don't know if they might be relevant in the kinds of systems we're doing, but but we ended up arriving at, and again, I don't know if this is relevant, but what we ended up arriving at is having the people that are being evaluated sort of write a self-evaluation statement, sort of talking about their own development, their challenges, innovations that they've tried, contributions, documenting contributions they've made to student successes, things like that. So I don't know if that would be valuable for teachers to be able to sort of talk about the struggles, the sort of insights they've had, the difference they've made for people.
Yeah, so going back to my North Carolina context, they do have that, right? So they have this student, or the teachers will self-assess. The problem is the use, right? So like, teachers will self-assess, but how is that actually being used in the summative evaluation? And is it or isn't it being used? And that's a whole nother study.
Well, a whole other thing is if you can give people an opportunity to respond to criticisms that they've received. And I don't know if they do that, instead of it being a one-time deal, like, okay, we're just going to use this data, but here are some problems. And then you can show that you've deeply grappled with the points and thought about them. So anyway.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And so it's like, what's the goal, right? What's the goal of these evaluation systems? Because what can happen is you do this formative feedback looping, and so at the end, everybody is proficient, and then schools can't fire teachers, which is what they like, which is one of the goals. One of the unfortunate goals is to like fire teachers. And so, yeah, so I agree with you that like this looping is, I agree that evaluation systems should be used in a formative, really like learning, growing, becoming a better teacher type of way, and not in a high stakes punitive way. I mean, so that, yeah.
I don't think it, I mean, I think at some point you have to have it in a high stakes way, but I think only after you've given, because I think it really is, there are very bad teachers in the school that have to be removed who really don't care, and you have to be able to identify them. But I think, you know, this sort of going in with this idea that everyone can improve and everyone wants to get better, and at least trying that approach first, and only if a teacher really does not engage with it, that then you start doing the more punitive things. I don't know.
What's
enough? Sorry, I don't mean to take over.
I was hoping to add to this a little bit. So the self-assessment thing is really interesting, but what if, you know, the feedback in which that they want to say respond to is already unfair? Kind of got me thinking, like, you know, this idea of, you know, how did I work on it, or how did I, you know, deal with it or improve upon? If it was already kind of an unfair judgment, say for example, the point about say rowdiness, but it's actually part of cultural, you know, sometimes it's a little hard maybe to take that and say, well, you know, you're just being not nice to me. Or you could instead say, you know, this is the cultural background, and you could defend that. Actually got me thinking, I wonder if there, instead of a peer review, I wonder if you could have a peer advocate, someone who is supposed to help you to say nice things and say, well, these are things. So rather than you defending yourself, right, which could come off as defensive, or you know, I wonder if you could have someone whose job is to advocate, and if they really couldn't come up with how to advocate, then maybe that's a sign, right?
Yeah. No, that is a really good thought. Like I thought about it only in the sense of the appeal process, right? So after you receive the lower rating, then you can appeal, and then you will have a district advocate. But just baking it into the actual the process to begin with, where you always have a peer advocate, I think that's a really good it's a really good idea.
I also have two other comments in the chat that I want to make sure I read off here. So we have one, I definitely think making sure the board who is responsible for creating the rubric needs to become a more diverse group of people. That way the diverse teachers who are evaluated are being evaluated by people who come from all backgrounds as well.
Amen.
And then another comment, I think having multiple types of evaluations, for example, surveys, in-person evaluations, self-reporting tests, and possibly getting feedback from multiple sources, other colleagues, teachers at the school, students, the educators, may help getting a broader view on what is happening in the classroom.
No, yes, I agree with both of those points. Yeah, and I know that they have the multiple types of evaluations. So, you know, like I said, that they use a test, and then they also use these in-persons. But yeah, pulling in students and getting student voice, maybe even parental voice. Although it's harder to get parent survey data in terms of the response rates. But yeah, those are good thoughts.
I think picking off the sort of test piece and thinking a little bit broader, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, Dr. Campbell, about like how we're defining success and like what it is that we're even evaluating.
I think we're defining success based on test performance. I think that we've been doing this since the 80s, actually. And so I think we're just so used to testing, like standardized tests as a way to measure learning, that we don't know how to see something another way. So what was your question? What was the second part?
I think just if you had any thoughts, I mean, I'm thinking like, what should we be measuring? I'm thinking like, you know, I sat in a conference earlier this morning where we were talking about, you know, like recruitment and retention of like students, staff, teachers, faculty, like of color, and also just, you know, thinking about having more diverse people in education. And one thing that we were talking about was like, okay, well, what about like, you know, belonging, for example, as a metric of success? Like, how do you measure belonging among staff, faculty, students? Like, what would it look like then to create, I'm thinking now in your context, Dr. Campbell, like, what would it look like to create an evaluation system that measures like a teacher's effectiveness at creating like an environment that fosters belonging, for example?
Yes. So yes, I think that measuring belongingness, measuring just how we think about like multiple measures in terms of evaluations and tests. I think we need to have multiple measures in terms of student success. And so their belongingness, their feeling able to listen, even thinking about measuring joy, right? Like, I think that's something that people like, oh, like that is a real measure when you are in a schooling environment that is very violent to your own body, right? And so like, there are a lot of measures that we can think about, like joy, happiness, healing. We think about like any abolitionist word, right, is measurable, like creativity, being able to innovate, being able to like, as a lot of folks talk about, like being able to thrive. Like how can we create a measure of thriving for Black, or not Black, but for students of color writ large, right? How do we measure thriving? How do we measure thriving for teachers, right? Teachers of color, because I think oftentimes we play this diversity game, a numerical diversity game, and assume that, like, you know, well, all we need to do is recruit more teachers of color and that's gonna change the world. And you're recruiting them into a place that's not inclusive. You're recruiting them into a place that is harmful to their own well-being. And so I think we need to take another step and start thinking about how do we create an inclusive space that is just, right? And that's we don't think about it. Like we just need to get you here. Like we get measured by our success as an institution, like universities included. Our success is measured by counts. Like how many bodies of color do we have in here? And if we have like a high proportion, then we're doing a good job. And then we don't think about turnover. So that's my rant about that.
I don't think it's a rant at all. Like, I think that's what people need to hear. Like, right?
Yeah. I just want you to do more than hear at this point. You know what I mean? Like, because they're actual, and I think that's the point, right? Is to see folks of color as human, right? These are people's lives that, you know, every day have to come into a space where they're not able to be their full selves. And you know, if we think about education, you know, education was not created. Education was in its beginnings in the US, was created for white middle-class male students. That is who it's been created for. And that has not changed. Like we have not really done any radical shifts. Radical shifts to change that. This is why, you know, the whole idea of reform is not justice, because we just keep making these tweaks to the same thing and we keep getting the same results. So thinking about education in the sense that like it was not created for folks of color. And so we're expecting schooling, not education, like schooling was not created for folks of color. And so we're expecting it to do this thing that it wasn't created to do. And so that's why a radical retransformation, like abolishment and creating something new needs to happen. But that takes some reimagining. That takes a lot of reimagining and a lot of seeing the humanity in all people. So, yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So, like, I remember being in high school and I remember like my calculus teacher and like other teachers from like different departments talking about they have to like, so I know they'll have like a meeting for like, let's say teachers of like, you know, for that department, let's say all math teachers. And I was wondering, so like, how are they provided with resources that are like missing for that department? Because I know, so like they look at test scores and all that, but we know that like, for instance, like the SAT is not reflective and like other tests like that of like how students do, because they're not provided with the same opportunities. For instance, other people might get training or like additional help for SAT and other programs like that. But how are teachers and students being provided like help for those departments? Because as we noticed, like English language learners and all that might struggle with like math and stuff like that. But how are...
I think it varies. Francisco, I think it really varies by school, right? And we know that schools vary in terms of their resources because of housing segregation, right? And so where do schools get their money? They get their money from property taxes, right? And so if we think about property taxes, then we have to think about housing. And if we think about housing, we have to think about housing segregation. And yeah, and so I think so. The short answer is that, you know, the resources schools have varies by school. So you may have some schools who do an amazing job in terms of their content groups, right? And they can, you know, imagine to the moon and back about things and offerings and resources and all of that. And then there are schools that don't have that. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I see we're at time, and Dr. Campbell, I want to respect your time also because you're on the East Coast and you're spending a late evening with us. Do you have any closing thoughts for us before we close out tonight?
No, like, do I have any closing thoughts? Because this is the last session of so what are my closing thoughts? So as I know you all have an assignment, which I would love to hear more about at some point, around like racism in design. Like that question in and of itself is just really interesting for me. But as you're thinking about racism in design, I think really wrestling with this idea that racism is woven into the fabric of US society, of our daily lives. And so in every aspect, right? Every aspect of design, of being a student, all of that, racism shows itself up. Racism shows up, right? And so I think my words would be to push towards understanding what is anti-racism. How do I keep moving on this journey of anti-racism? Because it's not a destination. I don't want people to think, okay, you know, I read this book, I'm there. Like there's no there to be. And so just knowing and allowing it to be a process, and knowing that you will fail and on this journey. But it's a journey. So that's one. Also, I think my biggest thing is that if we can start seeing folks as human, like fully human, I think that we'll be able to reduce, do something different. I know that wasn't the most eloquent whatever, but like folks are tired, folks are dying, and we need everyone to see folks of color as human. And I think that's it. I think that's it. And so that seeing us human is seeing us human in every aspect. So even the way you talk about people, right? So I'll say this real quick and I'll stop talking. Like even the idea of calling people of color minority, right? That's something that seems so subtle and so politically correct. But just think about how it can dehumanize a person, right? So you're calling them less than, you're calling them powerless. And that's not how I see myself, right? And so in your everyday language, just think about how do my words bring humanity to this person? Or how does it, potentially take their humanity away? So that's all I have. I'm excited for you all. I would love to hear from Liz or Ed about like what this racism in design assignment is and all that good stuff. So that's all I got for you.
Thank you so much. I think those were really important.